There was a time when the moment a person died, a set of specific tools came out. Tools designed not for the living, but for the management of the dead. Tools that solved real problems that every society in every era had to confront. What to do with a human body, how to preserve dignity, how to prevent disease, how to move remains across vast distances, how to protect a grave from the men who wanted to dig it back up. Most of these tools worked. That was never the question. The question that eventually ended each of them was a different one entirely. The question was whether a civilized society should be doing this at all. Most people today have never heard of these practices, not because the history was buried, but because the people who came after wanted very badly to forget what their predecessors considered normal. Let us get into it. Number 9. The safety coffin bell system. The fear that produced this device was not irrational. In the 18th and 19th centuries, medicine had no reliable method for confirming death in cases of deep unconsciousness, cataleptic seizure, or certain fevers that mimicked the stillness of the grave. People were buried alive. This was not a superstition. It was documented in medical literature of the period with enough frequency that it produced genuine public panic across Europe and America. The solution was the safety coffin, a burial container fitted with a breathing tube extending from the interior to the surface of the grave, a cord attached to the corpse's hand connected by wire to a bell mounted above ground, and, in some designs, a small flag that would rise if the interior cord was pulled. Cemetery caretakers were employed to walk the rows of fresh graves at night, listening. The system was real. Patents were filed. Coffins were manufactured and sold to families wealthy enough to afford the peace of mind. The problem was that gases produced by early decomposition caused the corpse's limbs to move, pulling cords, ringing bells, and sending cemetery staff into the dark in response to bodies that had been dead for 3 days. Grave robbers learned to watch for the bell rigs as markers of fresh, wealthy burials. The system that was supposed to provide comfort produced primarily false alarms, disturbed graves, and at least one documented case of a caretaker suffering a fatal collapse upon hearing an unexpected bell at 2 a.m. The safety coffin was abandoned not because the fear of premature burial disappeared, but because the cure had become its own kind of disturbance. Number 8. Corpse stiffening irons. Before modern embalming became standardized in the late 19th century, the interval between death and burial was a period of significant physical challenge for morticians. Rigor mortis set the body in whatever position it occupied at the moment of death, which was frequently not the position a family wished to display at a wake. A man who died slumped in a chair arrived at the mortuary with his torso curved forward and his arms bent at angles that no formal burial suit was designed to accommodate. The tools used to correct this were heavy iron rods, some flat, some curved, some fitted with adjustable clamps, inserted under the body or between limbs to force the muscles into a reclined and presentable position. In cases where rigor had fully set before the mortician could intervene, the rods were applied with considerable force. Families who asked what the process involved were told it was a proprietary preparation technique. When formaldehyde-based embalming fluids became widely available after the Civil War, the need for mechanical repositioning largely disappeared. The irons went with them, consigned to the category of things the profession preferred not to discuss. Modern mortuary ethics prohibit the use of force on human remains in any form beyond standard hygienic preparation. Number 7. Arsenic-based embalming fluid. The soldiers who died at Antietam and Gettysburg died far from home. Their families wanted the bodies returned. Transporting an unembalmed corpse by rail across hundreds of miles in summer was not possible in any form a family could receive. The solution was arsenic. Injected into the arterial system and packed into the body cavities, arsenic stopped bacterial decomposition with extraordinary efficiency. It killed the organisms that caused putrefaction so completely that bodies embalmed with it in the 1860s were still recognizable decades later, when graves were disturbed by construction. Undertakers advertised the results. Business expanded rapidly. The ban came from two directions simultaneously in the early 20th century. The first was legal. Prosecutors discovered that arsenic used in the embalming process made it impossible to determine whether the deceased had been deliberately poisoned before death. The chemical saturated every tissue in the body, producing results identical to intentional arsenic poisoning. Murderers were acquitted because the embalmer had contaminated the evidence. The second reason was environmental. As urban expansion disturbed older burial grounds, arsenic leached from thousands of bodies into the surrounding soil and downward into groundwater supplies serving the living. The substance that had preserved the dead was quietly poisoning the communities built around the cemeteries that held them. Old burial grounds in certain regions still register elevated arsenic levels in soil testing today. Number 6. Mort safes and anti-resurrection cages. In the early 1800s, medical schools faced a problem with no legal solution. They needed cadavers to train surgeons. The law provided almost none. Medical schools paid for bodies regardless of origin, and a profession rose to meet the demand. Resurrectionists, men who dug up fresh graves for money, operated openly enough in some cities that families knew their names. The response from families who could afford it was the mort safe, an iron cage placed over and around a coffin and padlocked shut, or in some cases, a heavy stone collar fitted directly over the burial site. The cage remained in place until the body had decomposed to the point of being medically useless, typically 6 to 8 weeks. Wealthy families also hired overnight watchmen. Some churches installed watchtowers overlooking their graveyards, specifically for this purpose. The mort safe was not banned. It was made irrelevant by legislation. The Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain and equivalent acts in American states across the following decades allowed medical schools to legally claim unclaimed bodies from public institutions. The supply of legal cadavers rose. The market for stolen bodies collapsed almost overnight. The mort safes were left rusting in churchyards across Scotland and England, monuments to a problem that legislation solved 30 years after it began. Number 5. The boiling of noble remains. When a king or a great lord died on campaign in the medieval period, the distance between the body and its intended burial place created a problem that decomposition made urgent. The solution practiced from the 12th century onward was systematic and practical and deeply disturbing to every subsequent era that encountered it. The body was dismembered. The flesh was separated from the skeleton and boiled in water or wine until the bones were clean. The bones were packed into a small lead container called the lead sark, sealed, and transported home for burial with full ceremony. The remaining material was interred locally, wherever the Lord had fallen. The Church tolerated this arrangement for over a century because the men whose remains were being processed were the men who funded the Crusades. Pope Boniface VIII ended it in 1300 with a decree describing the practice as an abomination against the sanctity of the human body. The decree was followed, partly because of the threat of excommunication, and partly because improved preservation methods had made boiling unnecessary for all but the most extreme circumstances. The tools associated with the practice disappeared from mortuaries into historical records, where scholars spent considerable time verifying that what they were reading was accurate. Number 4. Vampire burial implements. In the 17th century in Eastern Europe, a funeral was expected to solve a broader problem than it is today. It was supposed to ensure that the deceased stayed dead. Communities across Poland, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania buried their dead with specific implements designed to prevent the corpse from becoming a revenant. An iron sickle placed across the throat, a padlock closed around the toe bones, a heavy stone placed on the chest, iron stakes through the limbs, pinning the body to the earth below the coffin. These were not fringe practices performed by isolated villages. They were regional standards, carried out by people who had observed what they believed to be genuine cases of the dead returning. What modern medicine now understands as encounters with exhumed bodies in various states of decomposition that witnesses interpreted as evidence of continued life or movement. When archaeologists began excavating medieval cemeteries in the 19th and 20th centuries, The frequency with which they encountered these objects required an entirely new category of explanation, one that the communities who placed them there would have found completely obvious. Number 3. Anthropodermic bookbinding tools. This one sits apart from the others because it was never a funeral practice. It was a post-mortem practice, which is a meaningful distinction. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a number of physicians, lawyers, and collectors in Europe and America bound books in human skin. The books were usually medical texts, legal proceedings, or collections of poetry. The skin was taken from executed criminals, from patients who died in hospital care with no family, and from bodies obtained through the same supply networks that served medical schools. The tools used were identical to those of the leather tanning trade: scrapers, stretching frames, tanning chemicals, finishing implements. The distinction was the source material. The practice existed in a grey area where no specific law prohibited it, and no professional body had yet written the ethics standards that would later make it unambiguously impermissible. Dozens of books bound in human skin still exist in university and museum collections around the world. Institutions that discover them in their holdings now follow a standard protocol of DNA testing to confirm the material, followed by either ethical reburial or controlled curation. The tools that made them are not displayed. The books that remain are not placed in general reading rooms. Number 2. Mortuary totem pole preparation tools. The Haida people of the Pacific Northwest developed over centuries a practice for honoring their most revered dead that was entirely coherent within their understanding of the relationship between a person, their community, and the world they inhabited. When a shaman or a chief of particular significance died, the remains were compacted using specialized wooden clubs and placed into a tightly fitted cedar box. The box was then raised to the top of a mortuary totem pole, a carved cedar column that could reach 40 feet or more, where the remains would overlook the community permanently from above. The pole itself was a record, each carved figure representing a lineage, a significant event, a relationship between the family and the world they recognized. Christian missionaries arriving in the late 19th century classified the practice as an abuse of the dead, a charge the Haida would have found a profound misreading of what the poles were built to accomplish. Under sustained pressure from missionary organizations and later from Canadian federal policy, the practice was formally prohibited and families were required to bury their dead in the ground. The specialized tools went unused. The prohibition remained in place until indigenous cultural rights movements of the late 20th century began the slow process of legal restoration. Number 1. Mourning mirrors and the ritual covering of reflection. This one is the quietest item on this list, and it is the one that has proven hardest to fully abandon. The practice required no tools more elaborate than a length of cloth. In strict Victorian mourning culture across Britain and America, and in parallel traditions across Europe and Asia, mirrors in a home where someone had just died were covered, turned to face the wall, or removed entirely for the duration of the mourning period. The reasoning varied by culture and by century. In some traditions, the soul of the recently departed was believed to linger in the home before leaving, and a mirror presented the risk of trapping it in the reflection. In others, the concern was for the living, that a grieving person who caught their own image in the presence of death might themselves be claimed. The practice was never banned because it caused no physical harm. What it was, and what makes it the one item on this list that still persists in living memory in certain families, is an illustration of how the management of death extends far beyond the body itself. The Victorians covered the mirror not because they were superstitious, in the way that word is used dismissively today. They covered it because they understood that grief disorients, that the ordinary world looks wrong when someone is suddenly absent from it, and that a shrouded mirror is a way of telling a house that something fundamental has changed. Most modern homes do none of this. The dead are removed quickly by professionals with credentials and temperature-controlled vehicles. The mirrors stay uncovered. The house looks exactly as it did the day before. Whether that is progress or a different kind of loss is a question each generation answers for itself. usually without realizing it is being asked. 9 practices, none of them invented by cruel people, all of them invented by people solving problems that were genuinely difficult. What ended each of them was not the discovery that the problem had been imaginary. It was the discovery that the solution had costs the designers had not fully considered. Costs to the living, costs to the law, costs to the dignity of the dead themselves. They did not end because human beings became more sophisticated. They ended because enough people eventually looked at what was being done and decided they could do better. That process has never stopped. The only question is which current practices future generations will look back on with the same quiet discomfort we now reserve for boiled bones and arsenic veins.